Hi, so we're going to talk today about the scientific revolution. Here it goes. Okay, in the scientific revolution, we're going to go all the way back to the beginning of the 17th century through the 18th century. Okay, so in 1540, that's about the middle of the 16th century. You get this, okay, all the way up through the 18th. So it spans a long time. So think about, while this was happening, this is before Queen Elizabeth took power. This is still a time of like religious kind of warfare and struggle, and then this will take us all the way up to the French Revolution. Okay, so scientific revolution. What was revolutionary in new attitudes toward the natural world? So like what was such a, we're calling it a revolution. What was revolutionary? Another guiding question we have is, what does the name tell us about this historical period? We know it has to do with science. We know that it's a revolution, which means like a huge game changer. Okay, so it's a big change in scientific thought. All right, so we have to figure out, what are we changing from? When we first started class, we kind of did a comparison between the medieval mindset and the Renaissance mindset. So we still, even though we've had the Renaissance for a while now, in 1540, people still have a very medieval view of the world in a natural sense. Okay, primarily people explain things through religion and theology, which is kind of the same thing. Political theory, remember like Louis XIV and even like Charles I and James I were trying to base their source of power on God. That's a good way to say it, okay? So society is basically governed by church views, traditions, and practices. Superstition. People are still very superstitious about things like, oh, step on a crack and you get the plague. People like really thought things like that. And then not that specifically, but you get it. Step on a crack and you break your mother's back. That's a superstition. People are dying all over the place because of the plague still, at least until the beginning of the 18th century. So yeah, religion is still pretty dominant in people's explanations of worldview and what causes things to happen. So scientific thought in the early 16th century, so like the early 1500s, was still completely based on like these medieval ideas. All right, now we have to talk a little bit about ancient Greek philosophers. We have like our big three, and they are Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. If you don't know who these guys are, make sure you know who they are before you go to college, okay? Socrates never wrote anything down. Plato, anything we have written supposedly by Socrates, written down that Socrates said, was written by Plato, his student. Okay, so Socrates went around pretty much asking questions, and he asked people questions to lead them to wisdom. And he would say, like, if you know that, like, he would say, know thyself. Like, if you know truly who you are and are able to question everything and come to a solution, that's how you lead yourself to wisdom, by questioning things. Plato, his student, built upon that, and he believed that there were these kind of like eternal forms, we'll talk about this in class, projecting themselves into like a temporary or temporal universe. That means that he thinks that like somewhere floating up in like the universe somewhere, there's an idea of like chairness, for example, and that when you sit on your sofa, like your sofa possesses that concept of chairness. But the difference between your chair like in your kitchen and like the idea of chairness is that eventually the chair in your kitchen is going to like be destroyed. Like a million years from now, your kitchen chair is probably not going to be here. I know that's kind of depressing to think about, but the concept of chairness still exists without those physical temporary forms. Okay, so that's Plato. Aristotle believes that the eternal forms are found on earth, okay, that like it's within physical form, like physical forms define those eternal forms. So it's kind of like the opposite of what Plato thinks. Like they think kind of like the same thing. They both think that there are eternal forms and physical temporary forms, but he believes that the physical forms kind of like define the eternal forms. Okay, so the church accepted Aristotelian concepts of the universe, okay? So we're going to use the word Aristotelian a lot. When I say Aristotelian, I'm talking about things that Aristotle thought. Okay, so teacher, student, teacher, student. Okay. So Aristotle's science. Aristotelian science is a view of the universe that was largely influenced, okay, of course, by the geocentric view. So Aristotle looked around the world and saw that the stars and the sun all seem to revolve around the earth, okay? Like if you look up at the sky, that's pretty much what it looks like, right? So that's called the geocentric, because geo meaning like earth, okay, the geocentric view that held the earth was the center of a static, motionless universe, okay? So like it's kind of like a flat surface, and then kind of like around, I'm trying to think what you can picture here, like, I didn't do a good job thinking about this ahead of time, did I? Picture like a globe, okay? You know how a globe like rotates on an axis? Imagine like the earth was in the middle of that globe, and everything on the outside of that globe is like the sun and the stars, okay? So it's kind of like all that stuff just revolving around the earth in that way. Like there's nothing else dynamic about it, nothing else changing about it. So science was not like really its own discipline. It was really a branch of theology. It was just sort of a way of explaining the universe within the context of what the Bible laid out for us. Okay? I'm trying to think if there's anything else I want to say about this. No, there's really not. Okay, so we're going to keep going. So what were some causes then of the scientific revolution? Why? I mean, it still looks today, like if you look at the sky, it still looks today like the sun is revolving around the earth. So what caused people to even question that? What caused people to change that? Well, first of all, we have a lot more universities. You guys remember like how a lot of the priests died and they had to open up new universities, right, to educate new priests. Well, by 1300, philosophy had become an accepted discipline. So before, the only things you can go to, like, really college for, if you think of it in the terms of college, were law, and it was either canon law or civil law, so like church law or civil law, like in society, medicine, and theology. But then they're like, okay, philosophy, you can be a doctor, that's like your PhD, right? You can be a doctor of philosophy. Medieval philosophers developed a degree of independence from the theologians and a sense of free inquiry, so they could like inquire about things, question things freely without feeling that they would be persecuted because they're like kind of in the safe walls of their universities. Nobody's going to burn them at the stake, right? So leading universities established new professorships of math, astronomy, and physics. Now this goes all the way back to like Charlemagne in like the 800s, like 1,000 years, well less than 1,000 years, a while before we started this class. But Charlemagne believed that math, astronomy, and physics were three, I should say, of the 7 liberal arts, which he called like the 7 essential things that people should learn. So philosophy branched out into math, astronomy, and physics. Natural philosophy is basically what physics was. And like I said, all these 3 are subdepartments of philosophy. So we still don't have a concept of science, but they're like, well, we should study math and the stars and like the way that the universe works. So major scientific figures either studied or taught at universities. So again, all this knowledge and these ideas are contained right now to universities. Now, here comes along the Renaissance, right? The Renaissance is a systematic process of thought focusing on humanism, right, that eventually spread throughout Europe. So the Renaissance stimulated science by rediscovering ancient mathematics. So Pythagoras, if you guys have taken geometry, you probably heard of the Pythagorean theorem, okay? He was like this ancient Greek guy. So they rediscover all this stuff, and they're like, oh yeah, this is how math works. We should study it more. Renaissance patronage was also, so like people didn't just pay for paintings, they also paid for scientific ideas. People were interested, rich guys, right, were interested in how the universe worked. So that was one big cause. Another cause was, if you recall, exploration. Exploration was just absolutely necessary, right, for nation states to build and become modern. You needed to solve navigational problems. Okay, so while Portugal and Spain are out there expanding across Europe, across the world, they don't want to lose because of technical difficulties, right? How lame would that be? So they have to come up with these new instruments. We talked about when we talked about exploration: telescope, barometer, measures pressure, thermometer, pendulum clocks, microscopes, air pumps, all kinds of crazy stuff that it was absolutely necessary for them to develop if they were going to be successful at exploration. So in England, scientists worked closely with top officials in the Navy, and they became the main center of scientific activity during the first half of the 17th century, so the early 1600s. Why then? Well, remember, England is competing with the Dutch for shipbuilding, so they're going to do everything that they can to get ahead. Okay, so here's our pretty pictures again. Okay, so we have one more cause. Okay, we have the Renaissance as a cause. We have exploration as a cause. And finally, we have scientific methodology, like the way in which, like a logical way in which to do something. Here are 2 names: Bacon, Francis Bacon, and Rene Descartes. Okay, I know his name does not spell like it sounds. It's probably because he's French, right? Okay, so we have Bacon and Descartes. So Bacon came up with this idea of empiricism, which we talked about just a tiny bit in class last week with the Industrial Revolution. So empirical experimental research comes from Bacon. It's called inductive reasoning. Descartes came up with deductive reasoning, which is starting with a premise and then working backward to try and figure out how they got there. The way to remember this, the way that I like to remember this, even though I'm a vegetarian, is that bacon, you put it in your tummy, right? So it's inductive reasoning, and Descartes is deductive reasoning. So you got like Descartes, deductive reasoning. So it's a good way to remember it. It worked the last couple of years. Okay. If you combine Bacon and Descartes, inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning, eventually you come up with the scientific method. I'm sure you've all heard of the scientific method before. It's inductive. right? It's bacon-based. It starts by asking a question. I wonder how this works. So then you do your research, and then you come up with a hypothesis. Like, I think it works because of this. It's kind of like your thesis statement, okay? So then you test it with independent and dependent variables. You analyze your results, and if you were wrong, you have to go back to the drawing board. If you were right, then you report the results. It's called then a scientific theory. There's no such thing really as a fact. Okay, and just play with me for a minute. I know, like, you could say it's like a fact that we exist. So it's a theory because anything that you quote unquote prove in science, it's only correct until it's disproven. So we're operating under the assumption that this is correct for right now, but there's still a possibility for things to be disproven. Okay, so this is going to lead us to a new worldview. The scientific revolution became the major cause of the new world, and this whole new worldview, okay, I said this badly, but it's the major cause of the new worldview, I should say, of the 17th and 18th century. Sorry, my brain is still in exploration. Okay, so without the scientific revolution, the worldview that leads us to things like democracy, okay, social equality, okay, all these things come from the scientific revolution, okay, and that's what the 17th and 18th centuries are going to be known for. This is sort of our path to democracy and democratic ideas. Secularism, okay, of course, all these things are operating outside of the church, emerged, and many educated people became openly hostile to religion. Okay, so remember, like, way back in the Renaissance, and I was saying, well, a lot of you might think that the church wouldn't like the Renaissance because it's secular, but people at that point in history saw there's no conflict. It's like, look, we can draw beautiful pictures of trees and still be religious people. But now, after the Reformation and after people, people are just sick and disgusted with all the religious violence and stuff like that. People are looking towards science as like a way out of that, like, kind of nasty religious violence sort of awfulness that kind of characterized on the 16th century. So in the 17th and 18th centuries, people are going to become openly hostile to religion. Not all people, but people who are buying into the scientific revolution, not going to like religion very much. The revolution in learning became a major foundation in Western society, so it kind of inspires us to become more educated. So now I'm going to take you through each of our individual scientists. If you did a really good job in your scientific revolution who's who, you can flip through this part, but I'm just going to kind of briefly go through each of these guys. All right, Nicola Copernicus is Polish. I know he doesn't sound Polish, but he's Polish. And on his deathbed, published his On the Revolutions of Heavenly Spheres. Please remember that Copernicus wrote Heavenly Spheres. What you need to know if you're writing an essay is Copernicus, Heavenly Spheres, 1543. This is the kickoff to the scientific revolution. He studied science because he wanted to glorify God. He was a very religious man. However, in his research, he discovered that he felt there was a sun-centered universe. So of course he's incorrect because it's not the center of the universe, but he is correct in the sense that the earth revolves around the sun. So he comes up with what's called the heliocentric theory as opposed to the geocentric theory. He says Earth is no different than any other planet, but he's so terrified of what the church might do that he does not publish this while he's alive. Tycho Brahe vehemently disagreed with Copernicus, but ironically will help to prove his theory correct. He had the most sophisticated observatory of his day. He was a very wealthy upper-class nobleman, and he remained, like I said, an Aristotelian. He said, no, there's no way this Copernicus clown is right. But according to Aristotle, the stars were held in place by these things called crystalline spheres, okay? It's like they were held in place by these, like, kind of invisible orbs, okay? But through his observatory, he observed a comet shooting right through one of these crystalline spheres, which should have been impossible, thus proving that they didn't exist, thus further disproving Aristotle, which supports Copernicus. Now, his student Kepler did support Copernicus. So although he was a student of Brahe, he studied planetary motion, and he found that you could actually calculate planetary motion through mathematical formula. He was the first one to talk about having elliptical orbits, which are kind of like ovular. Oh, I just did that badly. How do I go back? Ovular orbits as opposed to like circular orbits. Okay, and he says that planets do not move at uniform speeds in their orbits. So sometimes they slow down, sometimes they speed up, depending on where they are in their oval or their ellipses. Okay. Now Galileo. Okay, Galileo is really going to be a huge name for you to remember. Galileo is Italian, and he was an early practitioner of the experimental method. Okay, he came up with a mathematical formula to calculate the acceleration of falling objects, and he put forward the law of inertia. So later on, Newton, when he talks about inertia, is building off the shoulders of Galileo. His discoveries were all supported using the telescope, and he challenges these sort of Platonic and Aristotelian categories of form and matter. Okay, so why does this say end of his life? So Galileo was actively persecuted by the church because Galileo was confident enough to publish his theories and basically say that Aristotle's whole understanding of nature, which is what the Catholic Church had officially accepted, is wrong. So of course the Catholic Church dragged him in and forced him to recant. And we'll talk about in class what he said in response to that. But Galileo sort of lived the rest of his life in house arrest. He was not burned at the stake because he did sort of compromise and meet them halfway, which, like I said, we'll do a little activity with that in class, reading his trial. But without Galileo, there would be no Isaac Newton, okay? And that's actually who we're coming across soon here after we get through Descartes. Okay, so far, if you've been paying attention to the dates, all these guys were really big in the 17th century. When you think of the scientific revolution, I want you to think 17th century scientific revolution, right? 17th century scientific revolution. Okay, so here come our two giants that yield us our scientific method. Francis Bacon is considered to be the father of the scientific revolution because he comes up with the inductive method. He takes all of the work of Copernicus, Bray, Kepler, and Galileo, and he proves how it can be replicated using the inductive method. His emphasis is on practical, useful knowledge, and he bases everything on empiricism, which is proving things through sense data. Can you see it, smell it, touch it, hear it, taste it, etc.? Now Descartes, okay, Descartes is a giant. He's a philosopher, he's a mathematician. We're going to talk tons more about him because we want to talk about dualism a little bit later, but we'll get back to that. Right now, what's important for you guys to know about Rene Descartes is that he employed deductive reasoning to prove his own existence, and that's what he's famous for. So that whole thing, I think, therefore I am, that is Descartes. In Latin, it goes cogito ergo sum. Okay, and so he wrote something called Discourse on Method. That's one you might want in your pocket, right? Descartes is your Discourse on Method guy. According to him, he says science must begin with clear and incontrovertible facts. You have to be sure about what you're talking about, and he needs that you should subdivide each problem into as many parts as necessary using a step-by-step logical sequence. So you can see how these two combine into the scientific method quite well. Okay. Now, this is Descartes' scientific method. He said the spiritual can only be examined through deductive reasoning. The material is subject to the experimental method. So you can't, he believed in a mind and spirit in your body, and this is this dualism thing I was going to talk to you about. Okay, so he believes that within each person, there are two forces at work. There's your body, and there's your spirit. Now, this will build into the modern scientific method, okay, which will combine both of, like I said, both of their reasonings together. Okay, but it's important to remember that Descartes thought things were divided into the spiritual and the physical. And here it is. It's called Cartesian dualism. Holy vocab, right? So Cartesian comes from Descartes' name, okay, Carte, right? So Cartesian dualism. Dualism meaning two, all right? So things are all divided into spiritual and physical. Finally, into the 18th century now, we're not going to talk about, he's going to be our master giant of science until we talk about Einstein, is Sir Isaac Newton. Newton was far from the perfect rationalist, but he was a great synthesizer of information. So what he did is he was able to take all of the amazing work that his predecessors had done and kind of blended it all together and made an argument for a universe governed by natural law. Now let's make a quick connection. John Locke, political philosopher, argued for natural rights. There are three natural rights that govern all human beings, regardless of where you were born or anything about you. Everybody, according to John Locke, has the natural rights to life, liberty, and property. Going forward, economic philosopher, economist, Adam Smith puts forward the idea that there are natural laws that run the economy, right? There's the invisible hand pushing forward the economy through the powers of supply and demand. Right, and so that's how he calls for laissez-faire, hands-off economics. Isaac Newton is an example of this idea of natural laws in science, okay? So he's going to argue, of course, Newton's laws of motion, that the universe is governed by these natural laws. And he publishes this in Principia, all right? and that's just mathematical principles of natural philosophy, but all you need to know for him is Principia. And that's in 1687. Okay, furthermore, of course, there are advances finally being made in anatomy, physiology, and biology. So I'm going to let you kind of read through this. These names are not going to come up on tests, but you might find this interesting. So all the way back to like Copernican times, people were kind of modernizing the study of human anatomy, which of course was kicked off by Renaissance artists who just wanted really realistic paintings, okay? You can see microscopy, and this is going to pave the way for microbiology. Starts at around the beginning of the 16th century here. Okay. Oh, geez, the beginning of the 18th century here. Sorry, it's Saturday morning. I'm kind of tired. All right, and then finally, here's something important to know. Just like our new nation states are competing with each other through exploration, and just like our modern nation states are competing with each other economically with mercantilism at this point, because Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations isn't published until 1776, they also compete with each other intellectually. They want to have the most modern, up-to-date information, and so they come up with these different royal societies, okay, for their countries. So England had the first, remember, because they're competing with the Dutch and they want to have the best ship technology. And then other royal societies crop up in Naples, France, Prussia, and Russia. Of course, Peter the Great is going to jump on this bandwagon, right? Because he wants to be super modern. So, I've, two more slides for you that I just, sad day. Did a quick review. Here, I should just do this the fast way here. Oh, Miss Miller, when will you learn how to use PowerPoint? It's a sad day today. Okay, here we go. Social impact, big ideas, and then we're done. Okay, so lots of social impact. We're going to do an activity called the hand and the glove. The scientific revolution is the hand, okay, that sort of creates, it's each of its little fingers directly correlate to innovations of the Enlightenment of the 18th century, which is almost directly responsible for the United States, for democracy. All the stuff that you, all the values that you like love and hold dear to you pretty much come from the Enlightenment. Okay. So without the scientific revolution, we wouldn't have that. Improvements in exploration. The spirit of experimentation, okay, helps to accelerate the agricultural revolution, right? It doesn't really perhaps help. It helped to accelerate the agricultural revolution of the 18th century, which we just finished talking about last week. Improvements in medical knowledge improve the quality of life, okay? Population studies. It's not like, by the time it's the 20th century, you don't have to like emotionally neglect your child because you're afraid that they're going to die because 1 out of every 2 kids survives. Like we have better health, okay, because of the scientific revolution. Reduces support for witch hunts because people are like, oh yeah, your superstition is not based on empirical evidence. You're just a loony. We're not going to burn people anymore. Science and religion were not in acute conflict, but the church, think about, well, and I'll leave you with this thought, why would the church be threatened by a revolutionary idea, like a new revolutionary idea that contradicted what they thought? Reformation. Right? The Protestant Reformation just happened. They're sensitive, they're vulnerable, they're healing, and they don't want anything else to challenge them. And so it's going to eventually lead to a decline, a further decline in the legitimacy of the Catholic Church because the Catholic Church fights it so much. But we'll get there. It's not until the 19th and 20th century that you start even getting people who are atheistic and around and things like that. So we'll move on. There's no attempt in the 17th or 18th century really to secularize science. Okay, people are still operating like Descartes and all these guys are still operating under the assumption that God created the universe. But we'll talk a little bit more about that with the Enlightenment. Scientists believe that they were studying, right, to analyze God's creation. So like I said, even though like the church doesn't like these new ideas, it's not like science versus religion until much closer to the 20th century. There's a universal agreement among scientists and philosophers regarding the supernatural origin of the universe, so it's all kind of the same point. We all think that God exists and created the universe, and the debate did center, though, on the extent to which, like how much of this is responsible by nature and how much of this can we attribute directly to God, like pointing his finger down and going zapping people into creation. So here are the 3 big ideas that you should remember. After the Catholic Counter-Reformation, right, that's that Index of Forbidden Books, the Benedictine decrees, and all that kind of stuff, the church became more hostile to science, and science declined in Italy because, of course, Rome is in Italy, but not Catholic France, okay? Because Catholic France is like, yeah, but Louis XIV did a really good job of making this really strong absolute monarchy that the church serves rather than serves the church, and so yeah, they're going to break off. But Italy, it's a little bit more inhibited in Italy. Okay, the Protestant countries, though, are going to become the leaders of the scientific revolution because they could care less about the Catholic Church, especially England. And there's an introduction of reason into popular thought. This is not just like a wealthy, overprivileged Renaissance humanism thing anymore. People all over throughout all classes will start thinking, okay, what's reasonable? What is the most reasonable idea here? Can I see it? Can I touch it? Can I taste it? Does it make sense? So this is kind of the introduction of our modern way of thinking, okay? So I hope you enjoyed the PowerPoint. Please let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you soon.